Hello, this is our fourth video in chapter 38 of our reproduction unit. And in our first three videos in this unit, we looked at concept 38.1, which is the life cycle of flowering plants. We did quite a bit of detail with that. So sexual reproduction of flowering plants. And we are going to continue today with concept 38.2, which goes into asexual reproduction in flowering plants. So these are your learning objectives. And again, you can pause and take a picture of them, or you can get them from the PowerPoint posted on Moodle. Okay, so asexual reproduction. How would you define asexual reproduction? Well, in asexual reproduction, there is a single parent, and there is no fusion of egg and sperm. And typically, asexual reproduction in plants is an extension of the indeterminate growth that plants have, which is one of the characteristics of plant growth. So in indeterminate growth, an organism continues to grow as long as it lives. In determinate growth, growth stops after a certain size is reached. So like in human beings, we grow for a while in our lives until we're in our teens or 20s, and then we stop growing taller. We're capable of getting fatter, but we stop growing taller. So we have determinate growth. In plants, there are certain organs that have determinate growth. For example, the flowers have determinate growth, but most plants as a whole have indeterminate growth. So think of a redwood tree. It lives for hundreds of years and it just keeps getting taller. So asexual reproduction is kind of an extension of that indeterminate growth, the ability of plants to continue to divide and keep and grow. So indeterminate growth in plants is based on cells or tissues called meristems. So meristematic tissue is composed of undifferentiated dividing cells. What do we mean by undifferentiated cells? An undifferentiated cell has not become specialized. So when a plant is mature, the outside layer has specialized into being dermal tissue, kind of like our skin tissue, and the inner layers of a stem specialize into vascular tissue, either xylem or phloem, and in between there is ground tissue. But in the dividing cells, at a shoot apical meristem, also at a root apical meristem, at the tip of a shoot and the tip of a root, these meristematic tissues are undifferentiated. They are not specialized. All of the genes are still capable of producing proteins and being expressed. So when one of these cells divides, typically one cell that is produced is going to be another meristem cell that is capable of dividing again. So one cell remains meristematic. The other cell will then differentiate into a specialized tissue. And we'll talk about the process of differentiation in a later unit, but it basically involves some of the genes being turned off so that they're not expressed. So what happens is if you have root or stem fragments, each of them has meristematic tissue and it can grow and develop into a new offspring. It just can continue to grow based on that indeterminate growth. So some mechanisms of asexual reproduction in plants. One is fragmentation, when the parent plant separates into different parts that will develop into whole plants. And some plants are specialized to do this. For example, there's a plant called kalanchoe. You can see it spelled here, kalanchoe. And we have some of these in our greenhouse. And these plants produce little tiny plants on the edges of their leaflets, little tiny plantlets on the edges of their leaves. And these plantlets will fall off and they'll grow into new kalanchoe plants. In a potato is a stem, and if it becomes separated from the plant, you can chop it up into individual pieces, and the buds or the eyes of those potatoes will develop into a shoot, and roots will grow. Maybe you have left your potatoes in your cellar for long enough that they've started to grow roots or shoots, and so you are aware of this ability of potatoes to grow asexually. Another mechanism of asexual reproduction is when a plant will send out a runner called a stolon. So these are strawberry plants that have sent out runners, and at the end of a runner, a new plant grows. And then this can get cut off. This stem can get cut off because new roots will grow down from each of these plants. So when you plant a strawberry patch, you just plant a few strawberries, and within a few years, it kind of takes over a bigger area and you have strawberries growing everywhere. If you drive through the mountains in Colorado, or probably up north in Minnesota, and you drive past an area where there are lots of aspen trees, they change colors at different times, but there will be groups of them that change at the same time. So this group of yellow colored plants there, these are probably all clones of the same initial root system. And these orange ones all probably came from the same initial orange plant, or it turns at a certain time. And so I have this word clone here. So anytime we have asexual reproduction, the baby plants, like these baby strawberries, and on the previous slide, these baby plantlets, they are clones. They are genetically identical to the mother plant, and they're genetically identical to each other. So all of these aspens that turned this yellow color at the same time, they are all clones of each other. And all of these ones that turned orange at the same time are clones of each other. Another mechanism of asexual reproduction in plants is one called apomixis. And this is when a seed, an embryo, actually develops, but it develops asexually. So it develops without the formation or without fusion of gametes happening first. And I'm seeing now that there's a little bit of evidence here that I borrowed this shamelessly from the internet, but I always try to tell you where things came from. This came from Dreams Time, and you can see that written right across your Dreams Time. But anyway, this seed develops without fertilization happening, without an egg and a sperm getting together. Okay, so many plants can reproduce both sexually and asexually, and there are advantages of both types of reproduction. Asexual reproduction does not require pollination. And so it doesn't require pollinators. You don't have to move the pollen from one plant to another. Clones are produced, and that can be advantageous if plants are really well suited to their environment and if their environment is not changing. The progeny of vegetative reproduction are often more vigorous than seedlings. Seedlings are often kind of frail and fragile. And so asexual reproduction can be advantageous in certain situations. Sexual reproduction, the main advantage is that it generates genetic variation. This genetic variation can be advantageous because it allows a population to have a lot of variability, and So if it's an unstable, changing environment, if there's exposure to new pathogens, then some plants might be able to survive even if many of the plants die off. If you have cloned plants, if we think about all those aspen trees, if one of them is susceptible to a new pathogen, maybe a new fungus or something, it'll kill all of them. So it's helpful to have some variation. Also, seeds and fruits are produced mostly by sexual reproduction, except in the case of the dandelions. But the seeds and fruits facilitate dispersal of the offspring, getting the offspring farther away from its parent, and that gives it less competition with its parent and gives it more of a chance to survive and make a life on its own. Also, seed dormancy is a useful stage that allows plants to avoid harsh conditions, and you don't have that option if you reproduce asexually. So, some plants are capable of either asexual or sexual reproduction, and so you have an experiment, a scientific skills exercise in your chapter, starting on page 834 of the Campbell book. And it shows an experiment that was done with monkey flowers in the genus Mimulus. And this experiment was designed to look at whether there are trade-offs between asexual and sexual reproduction. So here's the table here that is the results of their experiment. So what they did is they measured nectar volume that was produced by flowers, and nectar is going to attract the hummingbird pollinators. And so you can imagine nectar volume being a characteristic that a plant would have if it reproduces sexually, because the nectar is produced to attract the pollinators. They also looked at nectar concentration, how much sugar was in the nectar. They looked at how many seeds were produced per flower. They looked at how many hummingbirds visited the flower. And then they also looked at an asexual measure, which is rooted branches per gram shoot weight. So these shoots will produce rooted branches that can grow into new plants. And so that was their measure of asexual reproduction. So there are several different species of Mimulus, Mimulus rupestris, Mimulus eastwoodii, Mimulus nelsonii, etc. So several different species of Mimulus. And so they did all of these measurements on these 1, 2, 3, 5 different species of Mimulus. So looking at the data, I'm going to ask you a few questions and maybe try to answer these questions on your own. So as you're looking at nectar volume, nectar production, which of these other variables is positively correlated with nectar production, and which is negatively correlated with nectar production? I'll leave you to figure that out. And maybe in class we'll answer this question. And then which of these variables doesn't show any particular correlation with nectar volume? So which ones are positively correlated? Which ones are negatively correlated? Which ones have no clear relationship? And also based on this, which species do you think reproduce primarily asexually, and which ones produce primarily sexually? And what is it that leads you to think that? And then, which of these species do you think in the long run would be more resilient to changing environmental conditions? Okay, so just some things to think about, and we may revisit this in class. All right, so as we said, in many situations, it will be advantageous to plants to reproduce sexually, and the main advantage of sexual reproduction is that it generates genetic variation. But many plants have both male and female reproductive organs, both anthers and ovules in the same flower. So, because it's beneficial to have variation, many plants have mechanisms that prevent self-fertilization. The first of these is actually having separate sexes in plants. Now, many plants are what we might call hermaphrodites. They have both male and female organs in the same flower. If we were to go back to, I don't know, about slide 5. Okay, if we were to go back to the slide that shows the flower, we can see this is a flower that has both male and female sex organs in it. But some plants have separate sexes. They have some plants that only produce pistillate flowers or carpellate flowers, and some plants that only produce staminate flowers. And as an example, this picture, the above picture in figure 38.4, this top picture, it has some flowers that just have stamens. So those would be the staminate flowers. And then it has some that only has the carpels. So those would be the carpellate flowers. So that is called dioece. This literally means two houses. Dioece, two houses for your separate sexes. Some plants are going to have perfect flowers, so they'll have both male and female parts in both flowers, but the stamens and the carpels are either positioned differently physically or they develop at different times. And so either positions of anthers and stigmas or they develop at different times. So let's look at an example of this. So this part B of figure 38.14, we see that the styles in this pin flower, and these are pin and thrum flowers, which are different kinds of flowers on the same plant. These pin flowers have the styles above the stamens, and so there's no way that the pollen from the stamens can fall down on the styles. And then the thrum flowers have the styles below the stamens, and the styles and so the animal that pollinates it is going to get to these stamens long before it ever gets down to the styles. So there might be some pollen that falls down onto the styles, but this kind of an arrangement helps ensure cross-pollination rather than self-pollination. Many plants, their stamens will develop and release their pollen, and then later, a day or two later, the carpels will develop and the stigmas won't be receptive to the pollen until after the stamens have shriveled up. And then a fourth type of mechanism that prevents self-fertilization is self-incompatibility. And this is when a plant, the stigma of a plant is able to tell whether the pollen came from the same plant or from a close relative of that plant, and it will not accept that pollen. It will cause that, it will either prevent the pollen tube from growing or it will kill the pollen tube after it starts to grow. And so it prevents that self-pollination. This self-incompatibility is based on a particular gene, the self-incompatibility gene, which is why it's called S, and there are a whole bunch of different S alleles. So let's say you had a flower over here. I'm going to try to draw a picture here. Let's say you have a flower over here. I'm going to draw a very diagrammatic flower. And let's say this particular one has alleles S1 and S2. So then if another flower, same species, has the alleles S2, sorry about that, S, and maybe S3. If pollen from this plant landed on this flower, then it would recognize the S2 as being the same as its own, and it would reject that pollen. But if we have another flower over here, same species, and if this one has, let's say, S3 and S4, then it would be compatible with pollen from this plant because it doesn't match any of these alleles, but pollen from this plant would not be compatible with this plant. So these two are compatible, but neither one of these is compatible with the middle one. So I don't know if my drawings are helping here, but this is the idea of self-incompatibility. Okay, and an example that's near and dear to my heart is Echinacea angustifolia, which is also known as narrow-leaved purple coneflower. It's the plant that I study, and it lives in the prairies. It's a long-lived perennial. You can see its flower here, but these plants are incompatible, self-incompatible, and it has an inflorescence where it's got a whole bunch of individual florets as part of a big head. And so it produces pollen, and the pollen that it produces is incompatible with the flowers on the same head. So it is self-incompatible. This ends up being kind of problematic for plants that are growing in small populations, because if you're in a small population, it's likely that you are surrounded by close relatives. And so oftentimes one of the things that prevents Echinacea from reproducing is incompatibility with all the other plants that are flowering at the same time. Okay. So I think we'll stop there. And in our next lecture, we will go into totipotency and vegetative reproduction and tissue culture.